Ready. Oh, hold on. Okay, sweet, awesome. Looks like we have everyone here. So if we want to do a quick call to order.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Mike Garriak.
Yo.
Ken Safransky.
Here.
Maria Zamora. Present.
Jesse Rowe.
I'm here.
David Pollitt.
Present.
Melissa Childs.
Here.
Mayor Furman.
Here.
All right.
All right, awesome. So originally we had moved our bylaw adoption down because we didn't know Clayton was going to join us a little bit later. But Clayton, if you're here, would you want to go ahead and start with bylaw adoption, or do you want us to keep it lower on the agenda? And you're muted.
Well, that would impair your ability to hear me, wouldn't it? No, I'm fine to go ahead and start with the bylaws.
Okay.
Then I'll just jump off unless you need me to stay on.
Okay, great. Are you all okay if we move bylaw adoption up to our first agenda item?
Yeah, I would just also request, Clayton, if you don't mind staying on to talk to why we're considering the builder's handbook to be codified, because I think that's been an issue of concern and just a place where there's been a lack of legal clarity in the past. So if you could just walk through that with us too.
All right.
We'd love to have you for that agenda item. Thanks.
Okay, great. So you all in your packet have bylaws. These have been reviewed by Clayton as well as follow the guidelines for the historic for the SHPO. And just to note that these bylaws will have to be amended following February 7th, which is when ordinance 2023-11 go into effect, which allows for alternate members. So we'll have to amend the bylaws to allow for alternate members then. So we can, if we have amendments if we want to adopt what we have today and then make amendments for our February meeting or beyond, we can do so. So if there's any discussion we want to have about the bylaws, we can do that now. Otherwise, we can move forward.
Is this the version that we reviewed, not including any of the comments or clarifications that we talked about?
There's a few of those were addressed. I can pull it up, and recusals have to leave the room was one of them. A few of them were addressed, but not everything.
Clayton, if there's proposed revisions that we're just waiting on your feedback on, does it make sense to adopt these and then revise later, or to wait until we get feedback and then revise a final version later?
Hold on, I apologize. I'm having. Sorry, Mr. Mayor. Oh, there we go. It really is easy to change these bylaws. So, but insofar that they haven't been adopted yet, if we wanted to make changes to them, it wouldn't make sense to me to, go forward with adopting these knowing we're going to make substantive changes. But it wouldn't be difficult for the board to change these on the fly as well. You could, at any meeting, you could vote to change these with a majority vote of the committee.
And Clayton, if we were to need to vote on anything tonight, we would have to have bylaws in place. Is that correct?
Not technically. Bylaws are, your own internal governing document. I would suggest that you have them before you take any formal action, just so that you understand what your left and right parameters are. But there's nothing that precludes you from making a formal decision without them. It's just not good practice.
They weren't included in the version that I downloaded those attached to the email, so I didn't get to review like what changes were made and which ones are still outstanding. It just has this page.
Yeah, so I resent them out again a few days later, the next day. So you should have those in your inbox. And those are also online on,
When I click online, it said that no preview available.
yeah, it's in the link I sent you on the email.
That's the link.
Oh, that's the link I sent you on the email? Oh, there must have been a typo in that link.
Or I'm looking at the wrong email.
December 19th. The first thing was December 18th, and then there's a further one on December 19th. With the new attachment.
This is my fault, I'm sure.
It's a Word document, not PDF.
Shane, I'm just forwarding you those again.
I just did that, Lucy. So, I guess aside from finding the most recent version, I'm curious from the rest of the committee. I personally, I read them and I feel like they're really pretty straightforward. The one thing that I really like that you did here, Clayton, is I know previously we had Rob's rules of order noted, but there wasn't a requirement to vote. So I see you fixed that. So that looks good to me. I don't know if anyone else read them and had a question or a thought about something they'd like to change or see different.
No.
I read them, Jesse, and I had the same impression as you that they seemed straightforward and fit for purpose. I didn't have any particular comments.
Clayton, is there anything that you would want to draw our attention to that we might be interested in that you think is important here?
Not really. I did take the liberty of putting in Bob's orders versus Robert's rules. So Bob's rules, which is it's a simplified version of Robert's rules, hence the clever name Bob's rules. I just feel like it's a lot easier to deal with, and as we go through it, it makes a lot more sense for a committee not getting hung up on parliamentarian issues when we could just be making decisions and moving on. You noted that there is a basically adopting a forced rule that you have to vote unless you're conflicted. There is language in there that directs any recusals per conflict to leave the room so that they're not part of the discussion going forward. Let's see. I think everything else is pretty straightforward. Lucy, is there anything in there that we discussed that you'd want me to touch on?
Go ahead, Shane.
The only thing that I think still in here that I thought was meaningful was the conflict of interest policy, which includes a section that says if other people on the committee think somebody has a conflict of interest, we can identify that other person's conflict of interest and then vote to remove them from the decision. But I don't think that the other boards and committees in Silverton do it that way. And so one of the things we talked about was just aligning this conflict of interest policy with the town trustee conflict of interest policy.
Right. If that's in there, I apologize. I thought that my last recollection is that I meant for it to be reference the ethical standards and rules of conflicts that apply to other boards and committees. Is that not what happened? Is that my fault, Lucy? It's fine if it is. I don't.
Yeah, that line is in there. But that is something that I think we can easily remove and just note the trustees code of ethics like we discussed.
Right. So yeah, if that's in there, Mr. Mayor, if you want to I think we just need to reference the standing code of ethics and conflicts of interest rules that apply to other boards and committees in town for consistency.
I think that sounds awesome.
Okay. Great.
So you can adopt it subject to those changes as well. And as you're going through this, feel free to make the changes. And then if you guys are all on the same page, you can vote on it right now. It's not like an ordinance where if there's a substantive change, it requires further notice and rewriting it, whatever, you can do it right now.
And for the benefit of everyone else here, the issue is that in the conflict policy, the way that the Board of Trustees does it is it's kind of like a self-policing thing. So if I believe, it was like if someone say, do you think you have a conflict? Here's why you might. And then I can say, I do or I don't. And if Clayton feels strongly about it, he can weigh in. But then it's up to me to decide to remove myself or not remove myself. And if I don't remove myself, then it becomes kind of my legal liability for potentially having that conflict or having a perceived conflict. But here, the draft that I just asked to revise of the bylaws says that the rest of the board could identify somebody's conflict and then vote them out of the room. And I just feel like that's.
Yeah, it makes sense to me to have it consistent with the other boards and committees in Silverton.
Well, I wonder if we
Yeah.
should change that. Rest to the other board should change instead
Actually,
of this one.
I actually don't think this is a good idea.
You don't?
No. Because usually when something comes up that's contentious like that, I like the responsibility being on the individual who has the issue rather than the rest of the board taking matters into their own hands and kind of being like, well, we disagree with you. You need to.
I think it could, yeah, I understand.
Yeah. We've had some tense moments on the trustee board where I feel like the self-policing actually led to like more mutual respect as opposed to the majority rules version.
This brings up another topic, which is all of us were put on this board because we have some like interest or vested interest in the doings of the historic committee in part. Clayton, do you have like a guideline generally for us? I know we had a little bit in training last time about what constitutes a conflict of interest just going forward, since all of us are obviously interested in historic preservation in the first place.
Can I jump in real quick? Just because we brainstormed on this also.
Yeah, awesome.
And then I want to hear what Clayton has to say. But we were curious if we could come up as a committee with what that definition is. So like, I'm not going to vote on something an application that is immediately adjacent to any property that I own or have a distance that we all deem as sufficient, so that we avoid the issue of the conflict based on proximity of ownership. And I think maybe we discussed a couple other things, but Lucy, I forget.
Yeah, it was mostly if a property is adjacent to either a property that you own or where you live. I think that's what we were talking about.
I think that.
Okay, so generally speaking, we would have kind of a litmus test for that, it sounds like.
Yeah, so like it's possible that like you and Mike could both be conflicted on something since you are so close together in town. But I don't think any of the rest of us are so close together that we'd have more than like one member conflicted on an application that's close to their house.
Sure. Yeah, and I think Melissa owns something that's in proximity to me too. So like, I mean, I think it's just easy. I'm glad we're discussing this because I think it's easy for us to see how property ownership could be implicated, I guess.
And then Clayton, did you have any other suggestions or better ways to do that?
No, I mean, I think what you're trying to do is smart. There are, as to the question, yes, so there's a lot to do with per se conflicts and then perceived conflicts. The trick becomes, if per se conflicts has to do obviously with mostly financial situations, which would be a rare occurrence in this particular setting. But if you were talking about the perceived conflict of interest, which is what you're trying to, I guess, define by proximity to ownership, that would be helpful because, that's where we get into that gray area. And I think that it's smart of the committee to decide that, okay, this might not be a per se conflict because there's no financial interest involved, but we're going to say that as a rule, within however many feet adjacent to a proposed project that we're reviewing, if we live within that zone, that we have you're kind of like turning a appearance of conflict into a per se conflict by adopting some sort of policy. I don't think I think that is prudent. If everybody agrees. Now, that said, that's just because you live next to a project doesn't necessarily create a conflict if you don't make it one. But it sounds to me like that's the way that the committee is heading, is to make that a conflict. So it's really up to you. I can give an hour, 2 hour presentation on conflicts of interest and ethics, etc. But that's really the quick answer, which is if you want to self-police, then you're well within your rights to do so.
Well, I think it's just hard because, like, for example, if you do the notification for the current planning application, right, you hit almost the whole historic district if you are in the historic district by nature. So I think, at least me personally, I like the idea of us even putting down here, like, this committee deems it to be a conflict if you're next door, but if you're not next door, we don't think it is, unless you have a financial stake or something like that, unless that opens the town up to some type of liability or something.
No, it doesn't. You're just you're just identifying a personal interest, which is fine. You can do that.
What's everybody else think? Good idea, bad idea?
It's a good idea, but there's other types of conflict than ownership of the property. Might be like you could sell something to the person.
Yeah, I think as an additional layer of on top of declaring a personal conflict of interest because of some interest that you have that other people may not know about, maybe immediately adjacent might be appropriate. But I think on its own, it probably isn't enough, as Ken suggests. So I think as an additional item, it might be helpful, but I think there should be an onus on the individual to say, I have a conflict for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's always a conflict if the person, that's kind of how the ethics rules work, is there's always a conflict if the person brings it. You have to be honest with the committee, where if you might have a personal interest that would create a bias or otherwise cause someone else to question your objectivity or even the appearance of not being objective in a decision, then you should probably bring that issue in front of the committee at the outset.
Okay. So do we want to include that as a conflict of interest, an automatic one, or do we want it to be a situation where you say, I live adjacent to this person, I have feelings, it's going to be a conflict of interest, I'm going to recuse? Or maybe you have the option to say, I don't think that this is a conflict of interest.
I would pitch it as something we include because I think one of the issues that I've heard the prior version of this committee called the Good Taste Committee.
Right.
And I think like anything we can do to create a stronger perception of objectivity would be helpful, and to not have people weighing in on something that's like right next to their house they're going to see every day.
It should definitely be written, in my opinion.
Okay.
into
I'd
our
support that.
bylaws.
That's fine.
Okay. You guys agree?
No bylaws are perfect, and they will never, ever cover anything that comes up in the future. Something's gonna come up that is not written down, not clear, not in black and white, and we're gonna have to deal with it as it comes. You know that's true, especially in little old Silverton. That's true. So we can write all the regulations we want to and try to put in every amendment or whatever. We can try to make it we can make it more complicated. We can add 3 more pages of stuff, everything. But there's going to be things that happen that are not in these bylaws, and we're going to have to deal with it as it goes, just as long as we all understand that.
Well, if we have a guideline, then we can follow.
Yeah,
that.
guidelines, fine. But
That's what these are, these historic committee guidelines.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can always, like Clayton said, we can always make amendments.
Right.
So it sounds like everyone agrees then to include that. And Clayton, would that go in the bylaws?
Yeah, I mean,
Or
I think we put in the bylaws that I think
Okay.
something very, I'm just spitballing, but something along the lines of committee members who, own or live adjacent to a proposed project are considered to have a per se conflict and must recuse, et cetera, something like that.
Okay, Great.
And I agree with the other committee member. We're not gonna be able to game like every possible conflict. But I do agree that, the adjacent property thing goes a long way in creating objectivity and showing that you're, at least contemplating, the NIMBY, not in my backyard sort of mentality that I think a lot of people assume goes along with these sorts of things. And so heading that off at the pass, I believe is very prudent and smart in this particular case.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to be proactive
Yeah,
instead of reactive.
great. So we will remove the line that Shane mentioned and we will add in a sentence about being an adjacent landowner as a conflict of interest. Was there any other discussion we wanted to have on the bylaws at this time?
I think there's one other thing that doesn't necessarily have to be a negative, but that I noticed when I was reading these. And that is that roles and responsibilities aren't necessarily clearly defined for some of the items. Like, for example, take something simple like the creation of the agenda. It says, what does it say?
Can you let us
Sorry,
know
I
where
have
you're
it up.
looking,
It
please,
says-
since we have these?
What?
What page
Yeah.
are you on where you're looking,
Sure,
please?
Sure. So it's on page 3, section 6. So, like, for example, it says, and I'm just using one of the places where this happens, an agenda will be prepared for each meeting of the committee. So, like, that's an example of a place where implicit in the bylaws is this idea that something's going to happen, but it's not clear who is responsible for that thing. I'm assuming a lot of these things are going to fall to staff. Right now, we're really fortunate that we have Lucy and that she's strong and good at her job and everything else. And she's doing these things proactively. But in terms of the staff piece, there's just that part at the top that says that there will be support from the planning department. And I don't know if going forward, we might feel it's appropriate to codify who does what exactly. Like, for example, if we have to have minutes, is somebody taking notes? Who is that person? Is it the secretary? That kind of thing.
Yes, and in here it is.
Yeah, I think
so-
I think that's an example of one that is in there. But, like, for
Yeah.
example, the agenda making isn't in there. So there are some that are and some that aren't. And so I just wanted to call attention to that.
So I think we should add something to the duties or like part 4, section 2. That talks about staff role or just clarifies that.
Okay. Yeah, and what our plan was since you brought up the agenda, was to have the chairperson and staff work on that similarly to the way the Board of Trustees has staff and the mayor working on the agenda. But we can absolutely add a line to section 2 duties to talk about staff's role, and we can add the agenda into that section.
Yeah, and I don't think we necessarily have to make a lot of changes right now. I just think it's something that as we move forward and we create like disciplines of procedure, that we maybe codify them as we go.
Okay.
Was kind of my thought. I wasn't saying we need to like rehash the whole ordinance to make sure that any responsibility has a specific person, because we are learning as we go here. That's all.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. Okay, any other discussion? Okay, so then I guess someone would like to make a motion to adopt the bylaws.
I make a motion to adopt the bylaws as presented.
As revised or as presented?
As revised.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
I second that motion. I don't get to do that normally, so that's fun.
Okay, roll call.
Maria Zamora,
Jesse Rowe.
Yes.
Yes.
Melissa Childs, Yes. Mayor Furman.
Yes.
All right, awesome. I will make the revised, I'll make these revisions. I'll send them to Clayton and then I will send them off to the committee and you'll be able to review them before our next meeting. Okay, awesome. Well, then let's just go back to the top of the agenda, and we will get to appointments, in a bit. So ordinance, 2023-11, just so you all know, first reading was, approved by the Board of Trustees. It will go for a second reading, on January 8th, and then it will go into effect on February 7th. This was the ordinance to allow alternates to serve on the committee in place of regular members. And so alternate members will not be able to vote until after February 7th, but they will be able to attend and pick up packets. Any questions on that one? Okay, and then we'll go to 2, and then once we have a chairperson, they will be running this. 2 are land use application and requirements review, and I'll hand that over to Sheila to present on that.
Good evening, good afternoon. I'm here. Usually you're going to see Chris at these meetings, but Chris is traveling for the holidays, so I will be stepping in for him. So the first thing you have in your packet is an updated land use application, as noted in the packet summary. Typically, or what's been in the past is you've just had one application and it was for a use by special review, whereas there are a lot of different application types that are offered throughout the code. You have plats, you have site plans, you have your historic review committee type applications. So we updated the application so that applicants can just go through and check whatever it is they're actually applying for. And then when you actually see the application in your packet, it's in there as well. So it's clear on that. We know what they're applying for. We know what we're reviewing. And then you also have that information as well. The information on the application didn't change. It's point of contact. It's who we're going to be talking to. It's the owner. We did add a section that owners can give that authority to the point of contact, to the applicant. So before you would have to have a letter that says, I, as the owner, give John Doe the right to act on this on my behalf. Now we've kind of incorporated that into the application as well. So that is the new application. I hope you like it, but if not, give us some feedback. Do I have any questions on that?
I would kick that one to Melissa. And my neighbor here, Ken, because you have the most experience on the planning commission of the people here.
Well, I called Lucy about this, but when it says use district or zone, we also have overlay districts in a lot of parts of the town. And I thought that the overlay districts such as hazard or historic overlay should be listed to be filled out by the applicant on the form. You know, we have avalanche, flood, slope, hazard.
Yeah.
And 2 historic zones.
And what we'll do is we can add that part in. Sometimes they don't know and it's unclear, but we as staff can also go back and modify it and let them know that, yes, you are actually in a slope or whatever the hazard is. So we can add that in. Yeah. Any other questions, modifications? Would you like to see it again after we add that piece?
I think it'd be nice to see it again so that we also can see if there's any public comment on it. I don't know how much people care about forms, but the other thing that I saw, Sheila, that I really like that you guys have is like just a general narrative section. I don't know if there's some kind of guidance we could provide that says like, if you're, for example, doing something that is health safety related that might otherwise conflict with another policy, like feel free to talk about it here. I've noticed with some of the historic reviews previously that there has been kind of like a back and forth between the historic review committee and the building inspector, where the historic review committee will say, your windows should be like this. And then the building inspector says, for example, because these are on the first floor and they are for egress, they should be sliders, not tall windows, blah, blah, blah. And so if there's like a conflict between 2 different parts of, I don't know how this would reflect on the form, but it would be great for the applicant to be able to like give some background on that kind of thing prior to the meeting so that if, for example, we need the building inspector to come and speak to the health and safety items, like we know in advance and we don't waste someone's time and then kick their meeting down the road. Am I making sense?
We can try to do that, but I can tell you as staff, what we'll do is highlight that in our staff report for sure. So if there are some conflicts,
Okay.
we will highlight that. But if we can think of a way to bring that into this application, we'll do that. So I'll put that on there and we'll talk about it and see how we might be able to highlight what it is we want you to tell us in that narrative section. Okay, anything else?
The other thing that I know as someone who went through this process that was somewhat frustrating is like, I felt like I had to clarify more than once with various people whether or not we were building a new building, remodeling, or doing like regular maintenance. And I know that there are a bunch of different checkboxes, but I wonder if these checkboxes that you have at the top are like kind of two different categories. Like one category is like, what type of thing are you doing in general? Like, are you building something new versus are you suggesting to go through a historic AROD review? Because a lot of these things overlap. I guess, so that's another thought I had, is because it's really different if you're like working with an existing property or doing something new. And it'd be really great to know that immediately from the application when we first get it.
So you would like to have some kind of indication between the type of action and the detailed description of whether it's a new build or a rehab, remodel, something like that.
Just if everyone else feels like that's helpful. I think that would be helpful personally.
It's not going to apply to some of these categories, but it might in others. But I think it would be an easy enough, or we could just have NA on there as well.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's like a category like regular maintenance, right? Like if someone's replacing windows or replacing a roof, where in the future we might choose to fast track or have a different process for those types of requests versus, say, a whole new build in the historic district. I mean, again, this is the lens of the historic district only, not knowing that this form has to serve lots of uses. You know, maybe that's not relevant for other folks, but I think we have a request pending right now that's like changing out windows. And if there was a way for us to see that that's a category of requests that's really different than like an entire new build, I think that's what I'm going for here, if that makes sense.
Okay. All right, let us talk that over and see how it goes. And then maybe what we also do is after your first round of applications, we come back and revisit this if we find that there's more information that could be helpful, or if the information they're providing gets you the information you need. So I think we'll talk this through. We can make some changes. We'll bring it back. But I think really after that first round of applications, possibly January, February, we go back and revisit it then. How about that?
I think that's a great idea. And in the meantime, I think if anyone on the committee knows like a contractor or someone who does this a lot, getting some feedback on whether this is a user-friendly form or not would be great.
Okay. Anything else, or we'll move on to the checklist? All right, we're going to move on. Also, we did try to make it a Word document that they could fill in rather than having to handwrite everything. So that was a little trial and error. We had one submission come in and we had it in a PDF, but you had to have Adobe to be able to fill it in. So then we just changed it to a Word. So you can either fill it in with your hands or handwrite it, or you can fill it out online. So we hope that works better now. Next, oh, sorry, I guess Lucy, is this another agenda?
No, yeah, you're fine. Yeah, so next we'll move on to the Historic Review Committee application review checklist. And just to preface this, this was kind of came out of discussion from our last training, that the committee would like something in front of them, maybe a little more organized than just reviewing the historic, or just reviewing the builder's handbook. So this is a draft of what we came up with, and I'll let Sheila present it.
So what we did was we took everything out of the code and then we took everything out of the builder's handbook, and it's basically verbatim what is in both of those documents, and put it into a checklist and then separated them by the different categories and areas so that you can pull each checklist as needed to an application rather than having one whole document that you have to pull up every time. We looked at the scoring and we talked about it, and it's just, unless I can get some feedback from you on how you think that would work, we had a hard time figuring out how to make it work across the document because some of it's subjective, some of it's not. So we really had a hard time with the scoring. So we were hoping that maybe this would just bring it to your forefront. You could say it does or doesn't meet it, write some notes in, and maybe that would help you with your review of the applications. But I want to open it up to that first. Are there any major changes? Let's talk about the scoring issue and get your feedback on this one as well.
So I know I've been talking a lot, Sheila, sorry. So I think one thing that when we recently went through this process came up for us is we did engage a real estate attorney who basically said there's nothing in your code that says that this builder's handbook is something that you have to follow. It's essentially some rogue suggestions from a citizen group. And I've heard that from other people in the community. Now, I'm not an attorney, so I don't know whether that's true or not, but I'd really like to hear from Clayton because I think this document you've made is excellent, Sheila. I think you all have really taken exactly what we have in those two documents and you've translated it to a checklist, which is fabulous. But I do want to make sure that if we're using this checklist, we should be abiding by the builder's code and that that's important. And so I'd love to hear from our legal perspective from Clayton why we feel, because I know I reached out to Lucy with this concern and she mentioned that yes, she and Clayton had talked about it extensively and that we do feel the builder's handbook is codified. Maybe Clayton, you could touch on why that's true for us, like just from a legal perspective before we go down this rabbit hole of like really looking at this checklist.
And just really quickly before Clayton weighs in, I just want to read this section of code from the historic overlay district that says, incorporated into this ordinance for the purpose of review, approval, and denial of the proposed designs are the following. The regulations contained within the historic overlay district section of the municipal code and the two publications of the town of Silverton entitled Preserving Silverton and the Builder's Handbook. Just so you know that language is in the code. And then Clayton, if you have any thoughts.
So just to double onto the question, just because the builder's handbook is included, does that mean that we can't revise it? We can only make recommendations to the board, or is the reference to it mean that there will be a handbook that is being referenced, but we still have the ability to change the handbook? I think that's the specific question.
Okay.
Okay, that's two different questions, but I'm gonna do my best to answer them, I think. The first question is it codified? I think that was the intent. The language and the code references the handbook, almost like, you know, attaching an exhibit to a motion. And I think that meets the minimum requirements to make that more than just a suggestion, but that is actually integrated in the code. As to the second question is who has the authority to make changes to that handbook? I'm not sure because it is just basically the bare minimum reference. It doesn't say who owns and controls that document. I would say that because it is codified and it's part of municipal code, that as a general policy, you would only want the BOT to make those changes, because what you could have otherwise is, you know, rolling committees constantly making changes to a handbook, which is by reference codified as part of your municipal code, which is, you know, constantly changing without oversight of the elected members of the BOT. So basically you'd have, you know, citizen members of the committee changing the municipal code theoretically every meeting and or every other time the committee changes hands as far as control and trends go. So that's I hope that those are my two answers. I hope that helps. I'm happy to clarify anything.
I don't want to speak for Jesse, but I feel great about that. But I also want to address kind of the scope of this agenda item, which starts out in the overview by saying, while we're unable to change code or what is outlined within the builder handbook, we want to make this tool. And I think the issue that I have is that I thought this committee was put together to make recommendations. Like, we can't change it, but we should be working to change it.
Yeah, and sorry, I should clarify. I didn't mean we're unable to. I meant we're unable to before we review our first application, merely because of the timeline. If the Board of Trustees were to put in some type of a moratorium to do that, take extreme action, that would be that. But I was more insinuating that it's unrealistic to rewrite the whole builder's handbook before our first application review. But I agree, the purpose of this committee is partially to update it and to update our codes.
But make a recommendation to update it, but
Yeah.
Board of Trustees.
Yes.
Any recommendations? I think the ownership, I agree, should be with the Board of Trustees, whereas the Historic Review Committee is free to make recommendations based on what we see come in front of us.
Right.
Jesse, is that what you were getting at as well?
Yeah, I mean, again, like maybe something's changed, but when I read the ordinance, that's not what how I interpret it, but I'm not an attorney. So I if that's what the town attorney says is how this is codified. And even though maybe the history around this so-called handbook, I know it's not actually called the handbook, but we all refer to it that way. If that's where we want to go as a town and we feel like that's the most defensible way to review applications initially, that's fine. I just wanted to establish that as a group before we dive into the deep work that Sheila and team have already done for us, because I wanted to make sure that even using this at all makes sense.
Jesse, did you say it's not called the handbook?
Yeah, I'm confused. Is this the builder's handbook?
Yes.
Okay, then we should either.
Yeah,
change the name of
well,
this and
it
call
is
the Builder's
called that
Handbook,
technically.
or it should be called the Design and Standards Historic District. That's what it's called here. And that, just to clarify, not all of us are government junkies and know all this lingo.
Yeah, and
So, I
would be
personally need
careful.
clarification.
Yeah, I mean, I need you to kind of focus on my words that this is the minimum type of codification. I think you could do a lot better. And I thought that the handbook was labeled and because it's referred to as the handbook, it should also be titled the handbook. So, we don't want to have inconsistencies and multiple different things floating around. So I was under the impression that the handbook itself was actually labeled the handbook, and then it was a particular document that was known and quantified, and that was the reference in the code. And so that would be, the minimum requirement that I was speaking of. I think to Jesse's point, I think it could be done a lot better, so that there is no question. But insofar that the handbook is actually labeled the handbook and that's what's referenced in the ordinance, then I think you're fine. If you have some other document that's not labeled that, I mean, how would you know that that's what they're referring to?
Yeah, so it's labeled that on the town website. It says Builder's Handbook, Historic Design Standards, but the booklet itself says Historic Design Standards Booklet. And
It says Agricultural Design Standards in Historic Districts.
Yeah.
That's the title.
So the document itself on the town website, the title of the document, as in what the name of the PDF is, and then what the first page says are all different.
And the link is also different.
Okay, then hello,
Yes.
we need to change that.
Right. And so that's part of the reason that when we were going through our process, our attorney was like, this is clearly just a rogue document that no longer is considered serious. And again,
It is very
this was
serious,
18 months
actually.
ago. Yeah, well, serious in the sense of like not enforceable.
It sounds
Right,
like it's
so-
not, it sounds like you have formalization issues with that document. I think I wouldn't go so far as to say that, it's a rogue document. You'd have to throw it all out and start over. I think insofar that there's historical use and that it can be identified and there's no other conflicting document that somebody's claiming is the same thing. Like, if you have like two handbooks floating around that are completely different, you might have a bigger problem. But historically, if you guys have identified a single, guided document and that's it, I think we can clean it up and make it consistent, in short order versus, creating a bigger problem than we need to. The old mountain out of the molehill analogy. But, I don't know. If you feel comfortable with it and you guys all know that that's the document that everybody's referring to, and it's just not consistent. If it's not been consistently referred to, then we can change titles easier than we can change substance of the document. But I
Sure.
wouldn't go as far as to say it's a rogue document we have to throw out, but I would say that without further clarification, you are subjecting this all to a lot of unnecessary challenges, etc.
Okay, well, and I don't want to be obstructionist. I think the urban myth that I heard, which may or may not be true, was that this document was created, and by this document, I mean the one with 3 names that may or may not be referred to by the code, by a group of citizens who wanted to create a set of design standards. And the plan was to create a builder's handbook after that, incorporating those design standards into a code, and it never happened. And so I don't know if like Ken or someone who's been around a lot longer than me can speak to that. But my understanding was when the code rewrite was done that says builder's handbook in it, there was an intention to create a document that at this time doesn't exist. And so we simply relabeled something that was supposed to inform that document and put it on the town website. And that's as far as we've gotten. Does anyone else have better context on that?
It was developed by the Planning Commission with some help from mostly the staff, but also help from some people knowledgeable of architecture and historical architecture. And we've had this document for a long time, and I think that we expect it, I think as a committee, we could expect it to evolve. I've been involved for over 30 years, and all these codes are modernized or updated. And so, this is important to adopt it as it currently stands, but I think we need to look at it as an organic document. And, there's also, this committee realizes that there is flexibility in this process, and that's why there is a committee, not just a staff. But it was developed by the Planning Commission, 20 years ago, I would guess.
So it seems like there is a single document that everyone is referring to by different names on the website and in various places. Can we agree to formalize the names and get the title with whatever the title should be and move on?
That's all
Because
I'm
it seems like there is
requesting.
a single document. There aren't several versions floating around. Whatever the history of it, it is what it is right now.
Yeah.
Just need to formalize that and
Formalize it. Seems to me all we need to do is change the title page.
Yeah.
It's that simple. It'll take about 3 minutes.
Yeah.
I would like to point out something. We have run into issues in the past with this builder's handbook being referred to in the A-ROD ordinance as well. Okay. And so that means that this handbook applies to this checkboxes both for historic and for A-ROD. And that's an issue because in effect, it basically makes them no different. A-ROD was intended to be a lighter restriction. I mean, for example, the recessed entries, things like that, you shouldn't have to have that outside of the historic zone. But because of the builder's handbook, now we're saying that that applies to the entire overlay districts, both of them. And so that makes them really no different. And this has been a problem. And I realize it's in the ordinance, and I'm hearing that makes it law. But I'm just pointing that out because it basically makes A-ROD no different than the historic overlay.
Yeah, and acknowledging Lucy's, statement that we just can't fix this before the first set of applications come in. Like one of the major motivations of creating this committee was to overhaul this document and to better delineate the A-Rod from the historic district. Because you're right, the intention of creating the A-Rod was not to massively expand the historic district. It was to have a historic light so that there was some continuity, but not back continuity.
And I'll concur, that's the truth. That's what Melissa's saying. That was one issue we had as the planning commission, and we really thank you guys for getting us another board to handle this, but the A-Rod is supposed to be a much lighter interpretation of, I don't know if it's the builder's handbook or our historic standards in general.
Yeah.
I think the form, not the function, is that the builder's handbook will be expanded to include the historic district separate from the A-Rod, and the overall builder's handbook needs a full overhaul, and that's a big project that we'll be working on for a couple of years probably.
Do you think it makes sense for us to immediately recommend to the Board of Trustees the retitling of this document, or is that something that we don't even have to take to the Board of Trustees? That's something that we can, like who is capable of retitling the document so that there's clarity there?
I mean, I think it makes sense for staff to go ahead and take care of that administratively, but then we can also ratify it at the next board meeting saying, like, all of these code references to the builder's handbook, unless someone thinks there's confusion, there is another document. I don't think there is. And we can just ratify it after it gets fixed, but we could fix it, I think, administratively.
Yeah, this could be an administrative fix.
Yep.
Sorry.
No,
Part of this.
no, that makes sense.
Just observing.
I have a question also not on the substance of the checklist, but the scope of the checklist, I guess.
Okay.
So, and maybe this was covered in the training that I missed, and I apologize for missing the first one, but I'd like to better understand what the scope of review of this committee is. Specifically, do applications still go in parallel in front of the planning commission and this committee? Or the planning commission looks at the substance and we look at the architecture and design, really just aesthetic?
Okay.
Or are we supposed to be doing all of the things that the planning commission does when they review? And this is a leading question, and I'll tell you why, because a lot of the stuff that's in our checklist goes to more than aesthetic. So it talks about the substance and use. My understanding initially, and maybe that's different, was that this was the aesthetic review. Planning commission still pursued the full use and substance review.
Yeah, so the planning commission would only come in if it was a use subject to review. So let's say, something, I don't know if this condition exists, but if something was in the historic district and the avalanche overlay district, then it would go in front of the planning commission for an avalanche use subject to review. But the planning commission would not comment on the design or the aesthetics of the structure compared to the A-Rod and historic overlay codes. The historic review committee would be the ones to review and make recommendations of the aesthetics based on these codes.
So then I think a couple things in the checklist could be removed. So for example, there's, structure, use, and character. The first one's commercial uses shall be contained in 1 to 3 story mixed use structures with commercial and retail uses on the ground level and above, and or apartment dwellings or offices on the upper levels. None of that is something we should be checking yes, no, or other to, because that's just substance.
Well, so I think this is a great conversation to have, because that is, if you guys are reviewing applications based on the code, that was taken directly from the code you're using to review. So are you recommending that be removed from the code?
No, I'm saying that that's a planning commission or staff responsibility, and that's not what this committee was for. So just because it's in the code doesn't mean we're responsible for all aspects of that section of code.
Okay,
He wants us to remove from this checklist things that are, that the planning commission has control over, not the HRC.
Yeah, I
Right.
don't want us weighing in on, I don't want it to get murky about what our role is and like
Right.
into like, is this a mixed use? Is it retail? Is it residential? Is it the type of retail that's okay? Is it light industrial? Is that really okay? Like that shouldn't be a conversation I think this committee has.
I think it's useful to have either in the checklist or somewhere else the knowledge that those things exist, the structure, use, and character for this committee. But I think it's right to say not to be decided by this committee. So it's more for your information to be decided by planning review committee.
Yeah,
So
we
I think
can-
it's helpful to see that in the list, but not to make a decision based on it.
So much of this is not going to come to the planning commission because most of what is built or permitted is a use by right.
right.
We only review exceptions
Mhm.
to the rule.
And I think one of the things, well, it's in my head to follow on from Shane's comment, was that I think somewhere in the documentation or the application for membership of the Historic Review Committee, it referred specifically to the Historic Overlay District, but I don't think it referred to the Architectural Review Overlay District. So it seemed to limit the function of the committee to the historic district,
Mhm.
which if that's the intent, that's okay. But then there's stuff in here about the architectural review district as well. So it might be useful to clarify that.
Right.
So I don't know which is true. Are we just looking at the historic district or the architectural review overlay district?
Right. When we amended the code, we didn't change the fact that the Historic Review Committee reviews architectural review overlay district applications as well as historic overlay applications.
So it's both.
Yeah.
Clayton has to jump off. Is there anything we have for him right now?
No.
I have
don't
one other quick question, Clayton. So to Shane's point about kind of what goes before the planning commission and what goes before us, I think part of the source of the confusion here, I mean, not to harp on this document more, but with the builder's handbook, they delineate like what the building is going to be used for and then go into, and the checklist is structured this way too. And then they go into like, if it's going to be used for X, then here are the design standards. And I think that's part of what's hard about separating these two things is right now, this document that we have, which obviously we want to improve, like it does kind of mesh those things together from a review perspective. So I guess, is it even possible for us to break some of these things on the checklist out if our like whole purpose is enforcing this checklist or this, excuse me, the architectural design standards for historic districts, aka Builder's Handbook?
Well, I mean, you have the way I see it, you have two ways to do it. So what I've seen other municipalities do is if there's something in a historic zone, they are reviewed by the historic review committee only, and that particular, the historic review committee in your case, kind of determines all the requirements of an application, for within the historical zone, like, as its own little review. So there's one way that's like kind of take the place of any other review so that you're not adding an additional, level of review to every application within the historic zone. The other way to do it is to say, well, let's bifurcate what the historic review committee does versus any other advisory board or review committee does, and let's have it just be an extra step in the process for any building or application that comes through an historic zone, wherein that particular application has to go through the historic review committee and say like a planning zone or a planning commission, and then it gets finally determined by the decision maker at BOT. And so that's something that you guys are going to have to decide procedurally what you want the committee to do. As it stands right now, I think it's the historic review committee is clear that you've stood up this. I'll have to look back at the ordinance. Obviously don't have it memorized, but the way I understood it, at least, is that Silverton stood up this historic review committee to be like kind of the one-stop shop for determinations regarding any application or building within a historic zone. But, you know, correct me if I'm wrong there. That's an assumption based on information that I read weeks ago.
So you're saying the Historic Review Committee approves the land use as well, not just architectural and design?
That, I mean, it's up to you, and obviously that's something that needs to be, if it's not clear in the code, it needs to be clarified what your roles are to Mayor Furman's.
I don't believe that was the board's intent.
Right. Okay.
And I think that'd be very confusing where like some applicants go through a group of individuals who use one set of standards a certain way, and then other applications go through us. I think that would be very confusing.
So if it was the intent of the board to create the historic review committee just for the historical aspects of that particular zone, then Mayor Furman's point is correct, that you should remove any and all redundancies from whatever guidance you have in checklists. Otherwise, you're going to have these people jumping through the same hoop multiple times, which doesn't make sense. And it creates an administrative burden that's completely unnecessary to both the committee and then the follow-on review authority.
Yeah, I think we can take those out of here. I think what we would be doing is taking, if it's a use subject to review, Planning Commission could say, yes, this retail space can go in here. And then we bring it before the Historic Committee and say, it's a retail use, you need to apply these standards now. That's the way I see it working based on this conversation, is that Planning Commission, if it's a issue of use, then the Planning Commission determines it, and then we bring it to the Historic Review Committee based on what the Planning Commission's action was. If the use is a permitted use by right, then we just say it's a commercial use. Here are the standards that you use to review by. Does that work? And then we take out anything in this checklist that is under the Planning Commission's authority and not under the Historic Review Committee's authority.
Right. Yeah.
That sounds great, and I'm sure we'll figure out more along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I couldn't see who it was that said it, but to the point about having that information on the checklist, we could put it down at the bottom that, here are some other things that are involved that are outside of your purview, but just to give you an idea of what they are. We can put that kind of as a reference or a note at the bottom.
Yep, that was my point, and that would work for me. So.
Okay.
All right, awesome. So is there any other discussion on the checklist?
I don't think we've even come through it yet. This is just like the precursor.
Oh, okay.
So moving from substantive or moving from procedural to substantive around the checklist itself, one thing I noticed, and this is not really a fault of the checklist, it's just kind of already how the handbook is set up, is there are some scenarios the handbook doesn't address. So for example, in the Blair Street district, it addresses the scenario where you take a residential building and you make it commercial, but it doesn't address the scenario, which is more common these days, of taking the building and making it from commercial to residential, which has happened a number of times on Blair Street recently. Sheila, I guess I'm curious your opinion is with what resources we have available to us, since there isn't a guideline for scenarios that aren't covered. Is there a default kind of section that we would use for scenarios that the handbook doesn't entertain?
I haven't seen any. So it's almost, we could create a default section, and maybe it's or it's one of those that you put on your list of amendments you'd like to see made.
Yeah, and I think if the list of items to check through was pretty consistent across the different uses and the two different streets, that would be one thing. But there are a lot of things that are distinctly different currently in the handbook For example, whether the building should fill 25 feet, that's encouraged on one street and discouraged on the other. So that's an example of something where there's a direct conflict between, two simple scenarios. So it's not something where we could just take an average or an amalgamation of all the scenarios and say, it seems the intent of the handbook was X, which is, I think, kind of what Ken and Mike were referencing before when they were talking about just, frankly, there will be a lot of situations that just won't be covered. What do you think would be best practice for us, Sheila, in the interim where we have applications to review and there's nothing codified?
If there's nothing codified, it's hard to give yourself that authority. And Clayton's not here to back me up on that, but if this is codified, it's basically the law. I think we could see about putting policies in place, but the problem will be is you could make that recommendation, and if the applicant doesn't like it, there's nothing that says they have to do it, because again, it's not a code, it's not a regulation, it's not codified, it's just your policy. So until it does get codified, it's simply recommendations and not anything they would have to do. So it's not to say you can't go ahead and create those, because then eventually you can work them into it. You can make those recommendations and as a committee agree to them, but it's not enforceable until it's a truly adopted regulation.
So we would essentially just need to get on as quickly as possible revising this so-called handbook in order to shore up those kinds of problems.
Maybe you address the things that are missing first, or the conflicts first, rather than completely throw it out and starting over. I mean, it's always better to just redraft, but in this case, it sounds like there's a lot of missing pieces and conflicting pieces, and maybe those could be handled sooner than later rather than rewrite the whole thing.
How do other people feel about this? Is this a concern for folks, or am I kind of playing devil's advocate here?
I think, to me, Jesse, I think there's going to be a lot of situations like you describe. I mean, if there's something specific, like you said, commercial to residential, that's happening frequently and should be in the purview of the committee, I think that is something that we should prioritize to have codified, as Sheila says. But I think there's going to be a lot of situations where we can't anticipate, and it's just something that we need to address as we kind of go along and as we review this design document and make a recommendation to the Board of Trustees. Because I think there's going to be too many instances where if we try to legislate for everything, it'll just get bogged down. But I think if there's something that you're aware of that has happened frequently, then that might be something we can prioritize. Otherwise, I would suggest that we tackle it as we go along.
Does it make sense to include this in our work session, Sheila? Like this kind of triage discussion?
I think so. I mean, I can leave that. I have Lucy weigh in, but I do think it's worth it to identify what your priorities are and then set those so that we, even as staff, know how to help you get there and what we should be working on first. But I do know you do have like a lot of pending applications out there that we don't want to hold up too much longer. I don't know if any of them are commercial or residential, though. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, a few of them are mixed use and then commercial. But yeah, this is definitely going to be a great conversation to have during our work session and with Clarion on updates we want to see. And then as we go through that discussion, perhaps we identify a few things that we feel we need to address immediately and that cannot wait. And then we can bring those to the board.
Yeah, I agree.
Are the applications within the historic district or the AROD?
There's one application within the AROD. There's two applications within the AROD, one commercial, one residential, and then there's two or three either commercial or mixed use within historic.
I think the A-Rod historic district issue is in my mind, the most immediate issue there, because we didn't intend for the A-Rod to be subject to the same requirements, but we also don't have, as a committee, any guidance for making recommendations that are different than what the historic district requires. So figuring out how we can fairly review these applications in January that are in the A-Rod seems like one of the most important topics. And I'm not sure, like, we're kind of just gonna either decide on the fly what we think the differences should be without actually when I guess we can't, we just have to decide on the fly what we want to recommend to the trustees. Or we need to have some other process in place for January for us to actually review that without holding them to the design standards and potentially blocking somebody from building something that we didn't intend to block when we adopted the A-Rod.
It's hard to figure what kind of means.
Yeah.
And I really like this. If it's not codified, it's hard to have the authority. It's just policy or recommendation. We've had things where we think we've required something and it doesn't happen because there's no enforcement or penalty. But the kind of historic is a judgment call.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the conversation when the trustees adopted the A-Rod was that the largest amount of undeveloped land in town is kind of the south half, both on Green Street, past where the historic district ends. Well, actually, yeah, both ends. But the A-Rod, I think, is predominantly from, what is that, 14th or 15th Street south.
Mm-hmm.
And so, or am I saying the number? I mean, 7th or 8th Street south, not 14th is up by the town hall right here. Sure. So 10th Street south. And so the idea was, if there's all this undeveloped property, we're likely going to see in this wave of people actually developing things here, a bunch of construction, and we acted hastily to adopt the ordinance so that we didn't end up with like a bunch of like different designs there where we had absolutely no ability to block it. So like if someone came in and wanted to build a mid-mod house, like we didn't have anything in the code that allowed us to say, you can't do that on Green Street, you know, and Fifth.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why that was adopted quickly. But then we were supposed to follow up and say, but we don't need you to build something that looks like the buildings right in the heart of Green Street and Blair Street,
Mm-hmm.
but it just needs to not be uber modern or totally different than everything else.
Right.
Right, because
So-
right now, I mean, anything that's built in A-Rod will have to have a recessed opening. Every 25 feet has to appear as a different building. Like, I mean, I just don't think that these are things that should apply to the A-Rod. And so when we look at these applications in January, we're beholden to the builder's handbook because it's the law. So that's tricky because we may have to deny something that we wouldn't otherwise.
Right.
But I don't think we should. I think we need to figure out a solution before
Yes.
review those.
And I want to talk about that, but I also just for context want to bring up that the builder's handbook is in the architectural review overlay district, which I acknowledge was not the intent. However, staff has been using that to give that to people who are developing in that area, in that district, and they have been using it to come up with their designs, which include these two applicants we have. And so they've already been using this and they have already submitted applications. And so maybe, I don't know if Sheila, if you want to chime in on this, but I don't know if we'd be able to change the standards for those specific applications. But that's absolutely something we can address right away. But I don't know if Sheila, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I would say that if they had some major issues, they haven't brought them up yet. So maybe they already are able to meet the standards and they're willing to meet them. And so it may not be an issue when it comes time to review it. But so far they haven't they haven't chimed in that it's impossible, it doesn't fit, they can't do it. So I think at this point, they've submitted thinking that they have to meet it, and they think they have.
I guess that would be something helpful. Maybe the board needs to clarify to staff at the next meeting that was not the board's intent to require them to do that.
Yeah, and I think that if we're bringing that up, then we need to change the code since it says the builder's handbook in the code. And that if that's something that you all want to recommend that we prioritize, we can bring that to the board. But
I feel like there's some things that didn't quite fit there because isn't the quadplex, it's relatively new technically within the AROD, and that definitely doesn't meet the builder's handbook historic guidelines.
I don't think it is,
No,
because
that's
it's not on Green
not-
Street or facing the highway.
But the AROD's way bigger than that. But we
The
adopted
A-Rod
it.
is everything on the highway and on the main street.
yeah,
It encompasses the Y and all of Green Street. So I don't think the fourplex is in the A-Rod, but
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure.
You're probably right.
I'm gonna just pull it up really quickly.
So on page 12 of the review checklist, there's the architectural review overlay district checklist, which is section 16-4-800, development in the architectural review overlay district, and that says additional design standards. But are those the only design standards that apply to the architectural review overlay district, or is that in addition to the builder's handbook? Because if it's just those ones that are listed, those aren't to ownership. And that would seem to allow us to have a light touch when reviewing the two applications in January, and obviously not hold them to the same standards as something on Blair Street, but do that in a subjective way, since we don't have an update to the builder's handbook and won't have for a little while. So it seems like that provision on page 12 allows us to have something that's lighter touch than the builder's handbook in its entirety.
I think what I'm hearing though is that the builder's handbook was included in the A-Rod district ordinance that created the A-Rod, correct? It may not be within the land development code itself, but it was in the ordinance that adopted or established the A-Rod.
That's correct.
I don't think that's what we meant to do. But I could be wrong, but it wasn't what I meant to do.
No, it was not that. None of us were aware of that. Somehow that was like, I won't say that it was snuck in, but we just did not realize that the builder's handbook applied to A-Rod. So, but apparently it does.
And if you wanted to remove it, I mean, that is something that could just go back to the board and just modify that ordinance by taking that out, if that's what you wanted to do. Or even just have something as simple as, I don't know if this works, but you know, that they only have to meet 50% of the criteria or something like that, that gives you more leeway to do it. But at least that way you could take that ordinance back, amend that ordinance to remove that, and then they could just be subject to this, or you could add in whatever the criteria within the builder's handbook that you do want them to meet, or a percentage or something. I don't know how that works overall.
I think that's a great idea to remove that from the ordinance, because it's been a problem.
I think what David recommended is what we intended. And so I think where we had probably just a typo when we adopted this, section 16-4-800, subsection 2, intent. I don't think we meant to include the last sentence that says incorporated into this ordinance for the purpose of review. And that's pretty much a copy paste from the provision above. And I think that was supposed to get deleted because all of the other additional design standards cover our main concerns that were really urgent. The other main concern that we had, which is in that section 4A, was what if somebody, for example, buys the Armory or whatever that building is and then wants to tear it down? We didn't have anything or another historic commercial structure that's like the Rainbow Garage. Like we just didn't have any way to preserve those and prevent them from getting torn down. And I think those additional design standards covered most of the issues. So I guess this would be something the committee, we're outside our scope of this discussion sort of, while also trying to address this item. But I would say it would be good for us to recommend to the board remove that sentence from the code.
Okay,
Agreed.
I'd support that.
I think that helps us, at least in the near term, having distinct
yeah.
provisions.
Yeah, is that something we would need to make a motion on? Sheila, do you know?
I would suggest it for this meeting, make a motion if that's what you want to do, and then that gives staff and us the ability to then take it to the board. So that we have, the Historic Review Committee wants to have this removed, and then we can take that forward with your recommendation to have it removed. Otherwise, it's just hearsay that we heard them say this.
But in terms of timing, even if we recommend this and the board reviews that recommendation at the next meeting, we'll still have this version of the code in place when we review the first chunk of applications. 'Cause it'll
Your,
take, like,
your ordinances have two readings?
yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, then. Maybe not. What's the second Monday or the third Monday?
Well,
Sorry.
we'd have to notice it.
Yeah, we'd have to notice it 20 days before, which puts us at 25 days with noticing requirements. And the meeting is January 8th.
we can do it by the 22nd, but I don't think we can do it by the 8th.
No, we couldn't do it by the 8th.
Yeah. So that would put us at the beginning of January, and we're hoping to review these applications by January unless we have discussion later not to. But
We put this back to the applicants and say, we're recommending a change that's gonna reduce some of the requirements. Have you already met, in your view, do you think you met the requirements and would you like to proceed with the code as is, or would you prefer to defer your application until the requirement's been shifted?
sure. Yeah, we can definitely do that.
We're not delaying anyone that wants to just get it done.
Yeah.
Does that sound good to everybody?
Yep, I agree.
It does.
So we're gonna ask if applicants want to wait. And we're gonna recommend to the board to amend that section of code to remove the builder's handbook. Does anyone disagree with that?
It's
Okay.
always available for the applicant to look at anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Sheila, were you suggesting we needed a motion for this?
Yes, I think so, because then it's a recommendation from the committee to the board rather than staff just saying, we understood this. It's a directive.
I'd like to make a motion that we recommend to the board the deletion of the second sentence in section 16-4-800, section 2.
I'll second.
Okay, roll call, please.
Maria Zamora,
Yes.
Jesse Rowe,
Yes.
David Pollitt,
Yes.
Melissa Childs,
Yes.
Mayor Furman.
Yes. And if you need me to go over that reference again, because I said it real fast, I'm happy to.
I'd like to hear it.
Yeah, it's section 16-4-800, development in the architectural review overlay district, subpart 2, intent. And then it's the last sentence of that paragraph that we would like to delete.
So starting at incorporated, okay.
This refers to two documents, preserving Silverton, independent of the builder's handbook.
Mm-hmm. I've not personally seen preserving Silverton, so.
Yeah, I just did a search for that one too.
Yeah.
because I saw that.
Yeah.
That's a helpful update either way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep. All right.
And Sheila, do you think it's worth us going through this checklist now that we've already talked about kind of splitting it up differently?
I think maybe if you have feedback on it, you can email it rather than going line by line. I do want to talk about the scoring thing. Do you even see a need for the scoring? If you have just the yes, no, and maybe instead of other, we have comments where you can write in, you know, whatever your thoughts are there. the scoring was just really, it was a difficult one to come up with how we would do that.
Yeah.
What-
I'd be against scoring, Sheila. I think it implies a level of certainty that perhaps you don't have in a subjective decision like this. I think the yes, no combined with committee members' comments captures it in 90% of cases. So I think scoring is kind of over-sciencing it where we don't have that type of information.
I was trying to imagine the process, like, are each of us individually going to go through each section and cross-reference the application and make sure that every single section's met? And I thought that the more realistic process would be that staff or planning commission would hand us whatever checklist you're using, and you would just note where there's a miss or variation, and what you really need from the committee is the discussion and recommendation with respect to the things where it's non-compliant, as opposed to us affirmatively checking all compliance.
Yeah, and that is what a staff report will do. So you will have that in your hand. This was just at the request to have it organized visually in a different way. But we will review the applications and use what's required to come up with a recommendation for the committee.
Yeah, that's correct. So staff will be using this and saying whether we think it does or doesn't comply. But I think this was just an easier way for you to have a quick reference tool when you're looking at it to see if you agree with what we think or not.
Gotcha.
But you can also fill it out on your own. I mean, you could do this for each one individually. What we don't want to do is have this necessarily be part of the record, like that where everybody's filling this out, turning it in, and then attaching it as part of the record of how you made your decision. It's really just a working tool, a reference guide for you as the committee, more so than it is an actual part of your decision.
From my perspective, I don't know that the scoring's important, but the outline form, instead of looking at like the online code or a printed version of the online code, is super helpful.
Good.
And it's not
Yeah,
like
I think this is a fantastically productive document for us. I mean, obviously the material in it, you know, we can debate endlessly whether the sentence preserve the original storefront design of the building, including large vertically elongated first floor windows and kick plates, is something that we want in the future. But in terms of like translating what's there to a document in the for us to use, I think this is great. And I mean, I read both documents next to each other and I was like, they've really done a thorough job. And I think this is a really helpful tool for us. So thank you for the effort.
yeah, and I think it'll help you, like, as you're going through to even modify them later, you have everything right in front of you and you can redline sections at a time rather than having to go back through the code and find where they are. I mean, they're all in one area still, but it gives you a document you can actually work from. All right, anything else on the checklist? So what I have right now is that we're going to remove all of the planning commission actions or what's under their purview. Remove that, put it as a note at the bottom. And we're going to take the A-Rod. I guess we're going to leave this as is because we're taking that one section out. And I think that's it. And then we will include these in our staff reports as far as how they do or don't meet these standards when we're drafting those. Were there any other changes to this, at least for now? We know it might be changing as we move forward in the process, but for now, this is where we are.
No further comments from me.
I do think we'll change other to comments because I think that makes more sense. It's really like your notes section.
Cool.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks, Sheila. So now we'll move to appointments. So if you go back to your bylaws, you will see that we will have a chair, a vice chair, and then we will have a secretary. In the bylaws, it says that staff members can serve as secretary. And so our thought was having either Anna or Melina serve as secretary so they can take the meeting notes and not put that burden onto one of the members, if everyone's okay with that.
Absolutely.
I think that'd be
So
incredibly
then-
helpful.
So then we will elect a chair, a vice chair, and then we'll note that staff can be secretary. So I will open it up for discussion if anyone wants to nominate themselves or someone else to be the chair.
I do not want to nominate myself for chair or vice chair. I feel my inexperience at these types of meetings would hinder me. So that's my vote of no confidence in myself.
All right.
I'm interested in either being chair or vice chair, but if somebody's really excited to lead the meetings, then I'm happy to be vice.
Okay.
I would nominate Jesse Rowe as the chair and Shane Furman as the vice chair.
I will accept your nomination, Melissa. Thank you. I am not especially attached, but I would love to serve. I think my only thought was that our chair and vice chair should have some experience with parliamentary procedure, even if we're using Bob's rules of order, just to make sure we don't trip ourselves up in terms of order. But that's obviously myself and Shane both have that. But if there are other folks who are interested, that would be kind of the only qualification that I would be interested in for that person.
I am not interested.
I'd support Melissa's recommendation.
I agree.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay. Would someone like to make a motion to elect a chair, a vice chair, and then also just to note that staff will serve as the secretary?
Sure. I'll make a motion to appoint Jesse as chair, myself as vice chair, and for staff to serve as secretary.
Seconded.
Okay, roll call.
Maria Milano. Jesse Rowe,
Yes.
David Pollitt,
Yes.
Melissa Childs,
Yes.
Mayor Furman.
Yes.
All right, awesome.
That was easier than I thought.
Painless.
Great, awesome. Thank you, everyone. And then there's one last thing on our agenda, which is regular meeting schedule discussion. So we need to schedule 3 things tonight. The first is our regular meeting schedule. We need to schedule our January meeting, which might not align with our regular meeting schedule. And then a work session with the Planning Commission in Clarion to discuss the code updates for the Historic Overlay District and for the A-Rod. So I was thinking we could just discuss the regular meeting schedule, the January, and then the work session, if that works for everyone. Okay. I'm gonna put a visual up just so we can look at a calendar, which might be helpful. Let me share my screen here.
And Lucy, can I just request that you run the rest of the meeting? I apologize. I'm really getting over being sick or Shane, but not me. Based on it. I think we are going to anyway, and all we have is calendars, but I just want to say that I will be ready to run it next time, but I don't want to talk too much.
Yeah. What we have left is public comment and to adjourn. And Shane, if you'd like, since you're the vice, to do that.
You got it.
All right, great. Thank you, sir. Okay. I'm gonna try this.
I thought I was off the hook, Jesse, but so.
Okay. Here's just a visual that might help us with scheduling. So this is to schedule our regular meetings. This the month of February. But we can talk about it as the first Monday, the first Tuesday, first Wednesday, rather than the dates on the calendar. But I just wanted to show you that the Board of Trustees meets on the second, and the fourth Monday. And then the Planning Commission meets on the third Wednesday of the month. And Sheila and I discussed having the Historic Review Committee meetings before the Planning Commission meetings. And so these would be the best days to have regular meetings, is what's highlighted in orange.
Lucy, just out of curiosity, I know like someone like Shane, for example, already has to go to a bunch of government meetings for the Board of Trustees meeting. Is there a meeting that is scheduled for the second Monday of the month at like say 5 p.m. before the Board of Trustees meeting, that if we did our meeting like right before the Board of Trustees meeting, we would conflict with?
Yes, there are work sessions occasionally for the Board of Trustees meetings held at 5.
Okay.
It would often end up in a conflict, which is a bummer because that would be the most wonderful addition to my schedule that I could imagine.
Yeah, I also would really love it to be on Mondays, personally. Maybe like the first Monday, since the second Monday is the Board of Trustees.
My request would be to have it be the same week as the town meetings instead of alternating weeks, because then I have meetings right now I have meetings every other week, which is really nice. But I would have meetings every single week if we have it offset. But that's
I would
just
say
me.
that it doesn't matter what day it is to me, but I like 3 o'clock.
Yeah. Me too.
Right. Let's do
Monday.
Yeah, me too.
Same as
the only problem with a 3 o'clock meeting is that will create potential challenges for the applicants attending the meetings if they work until 5 o'clock. Otherwise, I would say I would love a 3 o'clock meeting as well.
Yeah, I
How about
agree.
we go for the second Tuesday? Yep.
Well, Tuesday at 5 would be great.
Yeah, I don't love 3.
Yeah, that would work better for me. Tuesday at 5. I'd be okay with that.
Okay,
It's still early.
so we want to go for the second Tuesday at 5.
Is there no January meeting?
We're gonna talk about the January meeting in a second. It might not align with this one for noticing requirements, but
My only caveat to that is on that particular Tuesday, I will be probably out of town, so I'll just have to dial in.
okay, that's no problem. Okay, awesome. Well, since this is gonna be a regular meeting schedule, do we want to make a motion to adopt the second Tuesday as the Historic Review Committee's regular meeting time?
Yeah, I'd like to make another suggestion potentially. I know that we typically use the room that you guys are all in as our meeting room. I just wonder if there's any interest. We have a new conference room that is warm and has nice acoustics in the new building in an easy park. And I'm wondering if that might be better for us to be able to hear each other.
it's not set up
Also,
yet.
it's not okay. Sorry,
No.
I had misinformation on that. And I heard it was all set up and then it was beautiful. So anyway, I just know it's cold sometimes and dark in that room. And I was like, wouldn't it be cool if we used our new resource that we just spent money on as a town? But if it's not set up yet, then I rescind that idea.
That might be an option in the future. The other issue is that it doesn't have ADA accessibility. So we want to make sure that if these are public meetings, we need to make sure they're in an ADA accessible area.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I move that our regular meeting time be every Tuesday, the second Tuesday of the month, 5 p.m.
Second.
All right, roll call, please.
Maria Zamora,
Yes.
Jesse Rowe,
Yes.
David Pollitt,
Yes.
Melissa Childs,
Yes.
Mayor Furman.
Yes.
All right, sounds good.
Could I ask that you send those out in the near future? There's a calendar invite.
Yeah, I'll send out a regular calendar invite. And then the bylaws state that the packets should be sent out to you all 5 days in advance. If that works for everyone.
Yep.
Okay.
And Lucy, I will talk with you separately about a time where you and I can align on the agenda going forward as per the bylaws.
That sounds great. And then for the January meeting, so like I just said, the January meeting might not align because we're scheduling the meeting a little bit later with noticing requirements. So the best options are what's highlighted in yellow. And I will note that the 17th is going to be pretty early. We would have to notice that on the 2nd, which means we'll have to have the staff reports due on the 4th. And so that would be a little tricky, but if that is what everyone wants to do, staff can work to do that. But what I would recommend is going to the 23rd or the 24th, and that gives us some more times to have the staff reports prepared by the 11th.
Well, how about the 23rd? It's consistent with following the BOT meeting.
Yeah, that would be good for me too.
I will not be here,
Okay. Okay.
but if you have a quorum, please proceed.
Okay. Yeah, I guess we would probably need everyone else then, since we don't have alternates quite yet.
When
Definitely
will we have an alternate for the Board of Trustees one? Is that after the February 7th code adoption?
Yes.
Okay.
I will be here the 29th, 30th, or 31st.
Okay.
The 29th. Shane, you said you'll be here?
I'm here the 24th, 29th, 30th, 31st. I'm just not here the 22nd and 23rd.
Are you here the 24th?
Yes.
24th would work for me.
Yeah. Would you guys like
Yeah.
to do the 24th?
Yes.
Please.
Okay. Awesome. We will do the 24th for the January. And at 5 p.m. And then the last thing we have to schedule is our work session with Clarion. I'm gonna just put this next to it because we can do that on the same day. Clarion requested that we meet in the afternoon or the evening of a Wednesday in January, besides the 31st, which is our stakeholder meeting. So if any of these dates work for you, or if we want to hold the work session before the meeting on the 24th, we can also do that at 3 p.m. That'll just be a long meeting. Otherwise we can do the 17th or the 10th.
Can we just do the 24th and keep it simple?
That works for everyone?
Have a restroom break?
Yeah. Is there an opportunity to allocate more time to the work session and less time to the meeting? Like, we won't be able to hear applications yet, will we, in January? Or we will?
The January meeting is to hear the applications, yes.
Okay, so we would need to start at 5, not later, probably.
Yes, or if we wanted to delay that start time, it's just comes down to what's noticed. So that's up to you all.
And we do have 5 right now, so keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, that would be a long day.
I just think we can do them on the same day.
You don't think so?
We have no idea how long it's going to take us to get through.
The work session?
Well, but we also don't have any idea how long it'll take us to do an application review. And I have a feeling the first few will be longer.
Okay. So maybe throw that one out.
So I won't be around on either the previous 2 dates. So I probably won't be able to join. I'm in India, so
Okay.
time zone will be bad.
Yeah. And we could meet
Yeah,
beforehand to discuss things if you wanted to make sure that your input is.
I don't necessarily need to be there, I guess.
But also, was there someone else who said they couldn't meet at the beginning of January, though? Okay, sorry.
So we're looking at the 10th or the 17th.
I would rather do the 17th, so it's closer to our regular meeting.
Okay.
Things are fresh.
How much time do you think the work session should take, Lucy or Clarion, if you had to guess?
My guess would be an hour to 2 hours. Unless you all want to make it longer. But I think that, you know, that's the minimum time that would be required would be an hour. If you guys wanted to go over, I don't think Clarion probably has the ability to go much longer than 3 hours. I don't know if
I don't think anybody can.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
my guess would be like an hour and a half at the most.
I think the stakeholder meetings were only an hour to hour and a half. So I think.
Yeah.
it should-
Okay. And the purpose of our work session is to develop goals, right?
The purpose of the Clarion work session is to discuss issues within the historic overlay district code and the AROD code, so they can use that information to address it in the code update. Okay, so is everyone happy with the 17th? And then would you guys like to meet at 5 or would you guys like to meet earlier? 3 would work with Clarion, 5.
3. I'm saying, if you ask me, I'm gonna tell you.
Yeah. Does anyone else have a preference between 5 or 3?
5.
I would prefer 3.
All right, so we are still split.
How do you guys feel about 4 p.m.?
I'm just trying to not cut into the business day too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about, 4 o'clock? We split it.
All right, is everyone okay with 4? All right, great.
I love it.
We will do 4 p.m. on the 17th.
Jesse, are you good with 4? We were 2 and 2.
Yeah.
3, 5. You are okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
Actually, I prefer 5 and then I could make the meeting. Yeah, because that would be.
You could make the meeting if we went to 5.
5's okay with me.
Okay.
I'm flexible.
All right. Everyone okay with 5?
I already wrote it down. Wait a
I did too, but that's all right.
All right. We're gonna do
Yeah.
5 p.m. on the 17th, so David can attend. And I will send out all of these calendar invites tonight. And then if you guys have any issues, just let me know. If you have anything you want to discuss prior to any of these meetings, let me know. And we'll go from there.
Lucy, I'm gonna have to excuse myself.
Okay.
I apologize.
Yes, thank you. Great. Shane, you want to take over?
Sure. So we don't have anyone in person or on Zoom, so we'll open and immediately close the public comment period.
Wait, I have a comment.
Public comment?
I'm not on the board. I'm just an alternate.
Oh, never mind. We have someone in person. I'm opening the public comment period.
I am public.
But since you're the only one here, we will not ask you to step to the podium. You're welcome to make your public comment from your seat.
We're all ready to go home, so shut down.
I'll be pretty quick. I was just curious. I know we have 2 members of the town board here and we have a member of the planning commission.
One member of the town board.
Isn't Jesse on the town board? Oh,
Not yet.
yeah. But Melissa's here and the reason we have these people here is so they can be a liaison and tell their boards what happened here. And I just wondered, we need to keep the town board informed on the activity here and the planning commission as well. If these people will just act as liaisons and maybe put their comments on the agenda of what changes have been made, or will the staff provide the board or the planning commission with what has taken place.
Well, the staff will provide formal recommendations like to remove that language from the A-Rod. So I'll provide formal. And then otherwise we'll do an update, and that's where Shane will update the board on the past meeting.
And what's the best way to formalize that same update for the planning commission? Because like it's super important for the planning commission to know that we're going to not use the book for the A-Rod,
Yeah,
for example,
that's a big one.
assuming the board.
Would that be, Melissa, is that something that you could be in charge of taking back to the planning commission since you sit on the planning commission already?
Sure, yeah.
We could add it to the agenda for the planning commission.
And that's how it's
That's a
happened in
good
the
idea.
past.
So we can add an agenda update, or we can add an agenda item for a historic review committee update, and that's where Melissa can make an update. And if there's anything formal, I can provide that as well to the planning commission.
And according to Chris, it needs to be publicly noticed in advance of the meeting that that's an agenda item.
Yeah, I'll make sure that that's on the agenda.
Thanks.
Got it. So on the agenda will be HRC update at each.
Yeah.
At every other meeting, really, right?
Yeah, but that's it. That's the end of my public comment.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, so we now can close public comment. And the time is 4:55 PM. And as vice chair, underneath the wonderful guidance of Jesse Rowe and Lucy Mulvihill, I adjourn this meeting.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Great
very
job.
much for your time.
Woohoo. First
Great
meeting.
evening.
To the bell.
All right.
Organized.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Thanks, Sheila. Happy